Hello everyone, welcome back. In the past we've chatted about why we care about GDP and the different ways of measuring it, be it through expenditure on final items, the value added in each industry, or the income paid to those providing a factor of production, such as work time or capital equipment. In these chats we established that however we measure it, these measures of expenditure, production, and income all give us the same result for GDP. And this tells us that the amount we produce, the amount we consume, and the amount of income we have are all really the same thing. This is a very powerful result, and it's been used to say supply creates its own demand, or as the bloke on my t-shirt here says, that demand creates its own supply. Behind all of this, we always need a model to process how this works, and to truly understand how the macroeconomy works and what trade-offs there are.
However, out of context, this result is also misleading and can lead us to get the wrong impression about how society is progressing or the opportunities available to people. Even ignoring other attributes that economists like to add in, the distribution of income, environmental change, and non-monetary value stemming from your interaction with your community, this perspective can miss important things our narrow understanding of monetary incomes. In this video, we are going to think a little bit about that and see what are other measures we can look at from the national accounts that may give us a wider perspective on incomes. Back to you, Matt.
As we noted in a prior video, GDP can be measured by taking all expenditure on final items, taking all income paid to labour, capital, and through indirect taxes to government, or by calculating the value added in each industry and adding them all up. And each of these measures will give us the same number. This measure is amazing at helping us understand the use of society's scarce factors of production, giving us an insight into economic progress in a country. It allows us to understand and compare production and incomes between countries, and it provides a useful piece of information for asking about policy trade-offs when we use it with economic models. However, when it comes to cross-country and time-based comparisons, we immediately run into an issue. Prices change through time, and different countries use different currencies. If we are looking at one country, or countries with the same currency, then everything is in the same unit of account, which makes it easy to add up. But how do we add up a New Zealand dollar and a Japanese yen when we're looking at building a comparable measure of GDP? When comparing across countries, we need to adjust for the fact that different units of the currency can be exchanged for the same goods. So we can exchange a yen, or we can exchange a New Zealand dollar for what are the same products. Now we can't just use the exchange rate to figure out what an exchange value would be between those dollars and yen, as that doesn't give us the full picture of the price of non-tradable goods and services. And it can be excessively volatile as currencies are assets, and as a result they might be valued differently based on people's expectation of their future value. Given that, we will want to think about measures that allow us to adjust for both of those. Now we aren't going to focus on cross-country comparisons here, and so we're going to move that to the side right now, but we will cover it in a future video. Our focus here instead will be on when we have the same currency, but there's a time-based dimension. We know that a New Zealand dollar today cannot buy the same number of chocolate bars as a New Zealand dollar could when I was a kid, sadly. As a result, if we construct GDP just by counting the number of dollars spent on those items, then when comparing GDP numbers through time, we will end up with a measure that captures both the increase in the price of those goods and services over time, as well as the increase in the actual number of them. The measure that takes current prices to calculate GDP, which is the equivalent of just adding up the number of dollars spent, is called nominal GDP, or GDP in current prices. While this measure that instead adjusts for price change, sort of what we're after, is a volume measure. It will count the amount of what's going on, and we call that real GDP. Now, getting from nominal to real GDP involves figuring out a way to remove that price effect so we can get to the volume. We use what's called here a deflator to deflate nominal GDP to remove price growth. The GDP deflator captures how aggregate prices change through time. We divide nominal GDP by this deflator, and it gives us real GDP. As we often care about the amount of stuff available to buy rather than the number of New Zealand dollars floating around to spend on it, real GDP is normally the measure we are talking about when we talk about GDP as income. However, both measures are useful for different types of questions. So to give all this a bit of context, let's pull up some data and have a look at these measures for New Zealand. Okay, here we've pulled up a bunch of information from the Stats New Zealand website and made up some quick and nasty graphs. So apologies for the nastiness of them. So let's do this. Cool. Now if we look here, let's expand things out a bit so we make sure it's gigantic. We can see that we have nominal GDP and real GDP between 2000 and 2020. As we can see here, real GDP is increasing, although you've got the Great Depression there, and so is nominal GDP. Now note how nominal GDP starts below real GDP and then climbs above it. What does this mean? Well, it means that nominal GDP was growing faster than real GDP, which is what we would expect given that prices were rising during this period. Furthermore, during 2009, the two numbers were equal, which means that we've got a deflator that's deflating nominal GDP to get real GDP in 2009 prices. So that's how we can interpret those figures. This is the income of the nation. But as we are looking at incomes, we might want to know more about incomes per person or per capita. The income of an entire nation might seem a bit biased if we've got the number of people decreasing or increasing. So let's pull up a second graph that has a bunch of that stuff in here. Nice. So this looks similar, but we'll actually want to look at them together to figure out how the trends might be a bit different. So, pulling that up, we can see over here we have GDP, and over here we have GDP per capita or per person. As you can see, they're following the same trends, but GDP per person, per capita, is a bit flatter. And that's because we have population growth occurring, and when we take out some of that population growth, the income per person will be a bit lower. Now, this real GDP per capita number tells us that within New Zealand's borders, significantly more output has been created per person than was created in 2000. So in 2020, significantly more was made than was in 2000. Precisely, we can see down here that it's 38% more. Now, that's pretty wild. 38% more stuff in terms of value added is being constructed over those 20 years per person. Now, this opens us up to a massive world of questions. Are we actually using more inputs to do this, even in a per person sense? Are we working more? Are we using up environmental capital? Are we utilizing more physical capital that we've built up and sacrificed other things to get? Or is it that we've just learned how to use what we have in a better way, which is called multi-factor productivity? We go into all of this sort of stuff in more detail in our productivity video I'll just link above. Now, we aren't answering those questions here. Instead, we want to ask, is this income? Over to you, Gully.
Thanks again, Matt. Describing GDP and income in the way above is typical for an introductory economics course and feels very natural. However, it is also misleading. To truly think about income, we need to ask what income actually is. In Hicks' 1946, John Hicks stated that income was the maximum value which a man can consume during a week and still expect to be as well off at the end of the week as he was in the beginning. As one of the founders of the post-war neoclassical synthesis, and as a famous wealthy economist, it is this definition of income that captures what an economist is thinking about when they say income. It is then the equivalence between consumption plus savings, which is potential consumption, and production at the macro level that leads us to view income as essentially GDP. Income in this economist world is potential consumption, as it is this ability to consume final goods and services through time that generates well-being and welfare. GDP, on the other hand, is a measure of the use of factors of production to generate value added or output. The rationale for looking at this is to understand the utilization of factors of production, especially workers, in market activities. As noted by Matt above, the focus is also on the number of items. In this way, much of GDP is the act of creating some value associated with the final product that is consumed. But there may be cases where the factor of production is instead used in order to maintain how well off they are. Furthermore, there may be cases where the residence of the individual who claims the output differs from the residence of the factors of production. These differences will lead to a gap between our true concept of income and GDP, so let's talk about them a bit more.
Thanks, Gulnara. I always enjoy hearing about that framework for thinking about income. The issue I want to talk about a bit more is that of maintenance. The gross and gross domestic product does not refer to it being yuck. It refers to the fact that all investment is included in the measure. If you own a building and you use it to run a business, then that refers to a capital item that is used for production. You may invest in that building by adding an extra floor, improving the air conditioning, painting the building, or replacing the showers. These are all necessary activities, and these are all termed investment activity, and it's measured when it occurs. However, some part of it may refer to maintaining the productive use of the asset, keeping it as good as it was before, while some of it refers to increasing the productive use of the asset. Now, why would we need to maintain anything? Well, the time it takes a toll on all of us. I can already feel that in terms of my memory, but especially does this on capital assets. This depreciation in the usefulness of a capital item is sometimes called consumption of fixed capital, and GDP includes investment that is solely about keeping the capital item as productive as it was before. If we imagine someone producing something for themselves, the decision to repair something doesn't constitute a new thing for them to consume. So we wouldn't view it as part of their income or an increase in their ability to consume while maintaining their current position. It's necessary expenditure to maintain their current position. In this way, it's an expense. The measure that tries to adjust for this gives an estimate of depreciation and then removes it from investment and removes it from GDP. We call this net domestic product. Cool, so we're going to construct the net domestic product from Stats New Zealand data and graph it here as well. For this, we're going to subtract Stats New Zealand's estimate of consumption of fixed capital from GDP and then use the same deflator to work out a real value. Now, true net domestic product will look a little bit different, but this gets us close enough for our chat. And later on, we're going to use their real estimates of net domestic product that come from a whole different series. So let's pull all this up. Cool. So what's our graph over here showing us? Net domestic product moves in a similar way to GDP, but it's lower. This makes sense, as we're subtracting an expense that isn't included in GDP. That maintenance of capital is an expense that we had in GDP that isn't really income in the way we mean it. By taking away the part of GDP that needs to be used to maintain capital equipment, we have a more genuine measure of income relative to the definition Gulnara gave us above. Now this figure grew by about 37.7%, which is just slightly less than the growth in GDP over the same period. Now, why is that different? If the capital stock per person has risen, or the types of assets we hold now depreciate more quickly, such as computers, then the amount of maintenance that needs to be paid will rise. As a result, net domestic product growing by less is also consistent with the changing nature of the economy over the last 20 years, And if anything, that growth is still very, very impressive.
Things become more complex when we open ourselves up to the rest of the world. 3 things happen when we admit there are other countries. Firstly, domestic residents can own assets overseas and so are able to consume things that are produced overseas. Similarly, foreign residents can own domestic assets, giving them a claim on some of this domestic production that is measured by GDP. Secondly, domestic products might be sold overseas, exports, and foreign products may be purchased and consumed domestically, imports. Imports are part of consumption and must be funded to some degree by exports. If the relative price of exports and imports increases, domestic residents can now consume more for the same amount of production. Thirdly, transfers such as charitable giving and intermittences involve residents in one country sacrificing consumption to provide those opportunities to others overseas. In this way, GDP remains as a measure of what is produced within a country. It measures what is made with factors of production within national boundaries. But this doesn't immediately mean that it reflects the claim on products for people who live within those borders. Gross National Product, or GNP, is the measure that attempts to adjust for the income of domestic residents overseas and the income of foreign residents that is generated in the domestic economy. This is very similar to Gross National Income, or GNI. Conceptually, they should be the same, but in some accounts, the residency definition, or definition of primary income from factors of production that are included, can vary between the two. However, secondary income, such as the intermittences noted above, are missing in these measures. Adding in net transfers from above provides a measure termed GNDI, Gross National Disposable Income, as an aggregate income measure. By capturing all foreign transactions, the construction of this measure also captures changes in the terms of trade as income, in a way that GDP does not. Taking GNDI, we run into the same issue that Matt talked about above. There is some investment that is just about maintaining the stock of capital. Subtracting this depreciation then leaves us with 2 other measures that you may hear about: NNI, or Net National Income, and NNDI, or Net National Disposable Income. Well, do all of these adjustments change much? Let's look at the New Zealand data with Matt.
Cool. So for these figures, we're going to stick initially with the nominal data provided by Stats New Zealand. This is because the real figures are not provided, and trying to back out appropriate price deflators for different income bases might take a bit of time and not necessarily add much value for what we want to do. We have plotted a different series, as you can see here, which is Stats New Zealand's experimental national accounts. Now you can see from these that there are potentially a few data issues in this experimental series, so I want us to focus on the relative shapes of the series, namely, what's the difference between all of them. Now GDP is at the top, with GNI and GDI catching up through time. GNI and GNDI are also very close to each other, while NDI is then significantly lower than the others. This all makes a lot of sense. So why is GNI below GDP in New Zealand? Remember that we get to one from the other by looking at payments across borders. So we subtract the domestic production that is claimed by foreign residents, and we add in the foreign production that is claimed or owned by New Zealand residents. New Zealand on average borrows from the rest of the world, and there's income flows associated with that explain this gap. Now, when we look at these two series, one thing we miss, due to not including the deflator, is what happens with the relative price of exports and imports, or the terms of trade. This won't capture that, but this is something we know has changed in New Zealand a lot over the last 5 years, and substantially more over the last 20. So for this, we might want to consider how real measures may look very different solely on the basis of that relative price change. To do that, we're going to take a longer term series and pull that up. So let's go. Here it goes. Oh wow, this is interesting. Here we get a much sharper change in the relative value of GDP and GNDI than when we looked at the nominal values. Why is that? In this instance, New Zealand has seen a very substantial increase in the terms of trade, or the price of exports relative to the price of imports. When we deflate the two income series, the terms of trade difference shows up as another part of the change in these measures. In other words, through GNDI, we start to capture how the terms of trade can be seen as a form of productivity or a form of increased consumption for the same production. Between 1992 and 2021, real GDP per capita rose 58%, while real GNDI per capita rose 77%. This is a very significant difference. So how do we think about which income measure to use, which one we believe? The fact that New Zealand can now buy a lot more imports from its exports. Okay? The fact that New Zealand, when it sells something overseas, can now buy more imports with that because the relative price of exports to imports has gone up, is an increase in income in the GNDI sense, and it's not captured by real GDP. How does this work? Imagine if exports remained fixed and more imports were purchased by consumers with that income. Here, both consumption and imports would increase in the GDP equation, and they would cancel each other out. There is no more domestic production after all, but there's more consumption. There's more ability to consume while keeping your assets the same. So there's real income. Having people overseas give New Zealanders more products for the same exports is exactly the same as exports becoming more productive in terms of the amount of goods and services available for New Zealanders to use. As a result, understanding this change is extremely important for thinking about all sorts of questions, including things such as our productivity paradox and how wealthy New Zealanders are. So this distinction, what's happened in this data, is very, very important. As we've noted through this entire video, looking at national accounts to get an idea of material well-being can be complex, and Motu has undertaken substantial work trying to get a more detailed understanding of this in recent years, where they've actually built material well-being indices. I'll put a link to one of their recent pieces of work on that down below. However, by clearly articulating what GDP is and how it may measure some things we don't truly see as income, while missing other things that we do see as income, we've been able to work out some alternative measures that already exist in the data and help us chat about what is happening and what is driving things. These measures give us additional information which may change the way we see New Zealand's productivity performance, inequality within the country, New Zealand's wealth and income relative to other countries, and a multitude of other narratives that are given in the media and common in discussion. However, we're going to leave this here and would be eager to hear if this perspective is useful for you and it helps you understand a little bit more about our beautiful little island.